Genesis chapter 12 is one of those chapters that we are going to be talking about for the rest of the semester. It's just that important. So let me summarize where we were. The first day, this was the big idea. The second day, this was the big idea. And up till this point, whenever something bad happens, when the enemy goes on the offensive, God responds with something that's kind of, the fall happens and God gives us the curse. And then there is more sin in Genesis 6, and God responds with the flood, which is very destructive, obviously. Then there is more sin in this uniting against God at Babel, and God responds by breaking them up into languages. Now, when you look at the overall effect of that, it's like God's program just keeps getting beaten back, right? And He doesn't actually do much to solve things, and we just keep taking these steps back and back and back. And so what's going to happen today that's great, Genesis 12 to 22, God finally gets on the offensive. God's going to start fighting back. And here's what I'm talking about. When we look at this Tower of Babel, we just kind of covered it briefly last time, I have to ask this question: which was more devastating, the flood or Babel? And if you ask the question, which one would you rather be at as an unbeliever, that makes it a little easier. I think I'd rather survive, right? I mean, everybody starts talking German and mumbling, but that's not so bad, right? But truthfully, when it comes to what is more devastating to God's overall plan, it is Babel by far. Because with the flood, the whole thing starts over again, but with Babel, we're divided up. And let me just state it like this. The languages force a dispersal into divided nations, right? That's why God puts them into different languages, so that they can't get together to unite against Him. So they are necessary to prevent further worldwide unity against God, but they are regrettable because they are so foreign to the vision of a single life-celebrating community, right? Remember, going all the way back to Genesis 1 and 2, the big goal was to have this global community of people who loved each other, worked together, cooperated, and brought glory to God. When you have them divided up into nations, they're not going to do that. It's impossible to do that. Humpty Dumpty sat on a wall. Humpty Dumpty had a great fall. All the king's horses and all the king's men can't put this thing back together again until Abraham, until God starts working with Abraham. And this is what's going to happen. So this is our picture, the Creator, creation, fall, redemption, restoration. Maybe you've seen it in your Spiffo prof. Talk to you about this big meta-narrative, the big overview picture of the Bible. Where we are right now is this. We have seen Cain, we've seen Lamech, things are getting worse. The daughters of men, sons of God, things are getting worse. The flood, things are still getting worse. Babel, absolute bottom low point. But thankfully, at this point then, even though Humpty Dumpty is totally fragmented, fighting among themselves, right? God says, okay, let's fix this. And right here in the story of Abraham, things are going to start to get better. Right? So let's watch how this whole thing works, and I think you will, you'll see everything kind of come together as we go through. Right? So let's start out with Genesis 12, 1, 2, and 3. I'll put the text up here completely, but I want to make it a little more simple than that, and I'll say it this way. This big word which God speaks in Genesis 12 to Abraham can be summarized in three things. Number one, land. I want you to go to a land I'm going to give to you. Number two, I'm going to make a great nation out of you that will, of course, fill up that land. And then all nations will be blessed through you. Now, the visual image I want you to kind of remember is this one. I don't know if it's all that great, but at least it's there. Genesis 12:1 is the land. Genesis 12:2 is the nation. Genesis 12:3 is a leader. Now, at this point, you might be saying, whoa, hold on. Where'd you get leader? I'll explain that in a second. But just for your own benefit, when I talk about Genesis 12:2, I want you to know that's the nation part. 12:1, that's the land part. 12:3, that's the leader part. Okay? So this is, again, really foundational. You won't waste your time memorizing this. Just let that stick in your head. Right? So here's what I want you to know about this verse. Two concepts. Right? You ready? Here's the first one. The first concept about Genesis 12, 1, 2, and 3 is this. I want you to know where I get leader out of verse 3. Because verse 3 says, all nations on earth will be blessed through you. Seems like just sort of a generic, nice, vague thing, but it's not, right? You might think, looking at that this blessing is going to come from God to Abram, to the nations. But it's a little bit more nuanced than that. And the reason we know is because Paul tells us this in Galatians. In Galatians, he'll say this. He'll refer to Genesis 12:3 and say, the Scripture announced the gospel in advance to Abraham, all nations will be blessed through you. Now, think about the way Paul describes that. Paul says that's the gospel. We all know what the gospel is, right? That's the good news about Jesus. So Paul sees Jesus in Genesis 12:3. Do you see him there? You should, because if you're connecting everything as we've seen so far, you realize that Genesis 3:15 is never very far from the plot line of the story. In fact, it is the plot line of the story. So that when God says this in Genesis 12:3, what he's saying is this. It's not like this. It's rather this seed, and the nations get blessed through him, right? If you've been following the story along. So the message, you, Abraham, are merely the channel for the seed. He is where the blessing really comes from. Now, notice also that here in 12:3, which is where we are, not 12:2. 12:2 is the nation. 12:3 is the nations. Where do the nations come from? Chapter right before Babel, right? So that's part of the reason why I say here that Abraham and the promise to Abraham, God, it's not Abraham himself, right? But God's promise to Abraham in Genesis 12:3 is, hey man, we got to clean up that egg or that Humpty Dumpty. We got to fix that mess, and you are the means, you are the channel for the means by which that's going to happen, right? So the relationships and the rule, to be very specific about what the blessing is, the restoration of the relationships and the rule and salvation basically is going to come down here through the seed directly out to the nations. Right? Does that make sense so far? All right. Then let me take Genesis 12:1, 2, and 3 and plop it right down here on top of 3:15. I hope that makes some sense to you right now. Why? Well, because this leader of 12:3 is the seed himself. Again, I say leader, not redeemer, because he's not only going to redeem and save, but he's also going to hold a scepter too, okay? So that's why I choose that one word. So Genesis 12:1, 2, and 3 is directly connected to 3:15 because the leader is the seed of 3:15. But that might make you question, okay, how are the land and nation connected to it too? And they are connected directly. Let me show you how. Let me talk about nation first. In the book of Exodus, this is where God first fulfills this promise of the nation. He says it like this. He says, I will make you into a kingdom of priests, because up until this point, they had just been a bunch of individuals. Now they're going to become a nation, okay? He says, I'm going to make you, Israel, into a kingdom of priests. Now, in any situation, a priest is a mediator between God and people, right? He takes the prayers of the people up to God. He takes the blessings of God down to the people. He's kind of the mediator. Whether you're a Buddhist priest or Roman Catholic priest or whatever, that's what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to stand in the middle. But the weird thing about this statement is, I will make you into a kingdom of priests. Like everybody's going to do it, right? So the promise is that we're going to have a whole nation of priests. All Israel is going to do this. And that makes, in some sense, but in other ways it makes no sense because, wait a minute, this is all blank down here. If everybody's a priest, who is down there? But there actually is a really good answer to it. Are you tracking with me? Do you know who's down there? Who's down there is all the other nations of the world, right? And so the whole goal here is Israel is supposed to be a nation of priests, the whole world, to tell the whole world about, oh, come on, it's as easy as third grade Sunday school here, to tell them about Jesus, except that we don't use the word Jesus in the Old Testament, to tell them about the seed, right? The seed, right? The Messiah, okay, the seed, right? So that's what it's all about. That's what the nation is here for. Now, it gets even better. Watch this. Let's go to the land. Let's talk about how the land is connected here. A lot of people read about the land of Israel in the Old Testament, and they say, oh, it's a land flowing with milk and honey. Oh, that's really neat. It's this really, really beautiful, beautiful land that God wants to give to his people because he loves his people and he wants his people to have the best. They kind of mix a little American dream stuff in there, you know, with the biblical promise. Not a good idea to do, but the trouble is this, that when you get to the land and you think it's the Garden of Eden before you go. When you get there, you realize, no, this is it. And then you realize, no wonder they always stoned everybody in the Old Testament, right? There were rocks everywhere. And I'm not kidding. I'm being a little bit facetious, but not really very much. Now, you say, is all of Israel like this? No, there are a few beautiful parts, but this is not atypical at all. A lot of Israel looks like this. This is not nearly as pretty as Ohio or Indiana or Illinois or most anywhere else in the United States. This is Middle East, right? This is not pretty. So why, then, does God put his people here? Well, you got to take a look at the map and realize this, that in Europe, Africa, and Asia, Israel is right there, okay? And also realize that in the Old Testament and even in much of the New, you can't travel Mediterranean. Right? When Paul does it, he gets shipwrecked. Everything bad happens to him all the time when he tries to go across there. You also can't travel in here because that's desert. So, if you want to go from Europe to Africa, how do you get there? You have to go here. If you want to go from Africa to Asia, how do you get there? You have to go here. Now, let's put this all together, okay? Why would God take 2.5 million little Billy Grahams, that's what they're supposed to be, and plop them right down in the middle of the crossroads of the ancient world? You see his plan? God has not given up on the nations at all. God is going to reach the nations, plural, through Israel in order to draw them into a relationship with him. So, let's put this back together here then and just make a statement and say Genesis 12, 1, 2, and 3 is not distinct from Genesis 3. In fact, it is directly based upon and expands the original promise. So God doesn't come along here in Genesis 12 and say, wow, those nations were bad. I had to break them up into, those people were bad. I had to break them up into various nations. I'm going to leave them. I'm just going to save Israel. No. He gets Israel in order to get to the rest of the nations, okay? So that is the first big concept I want you to know from Genesis 12. Second concept is this one. When you look at the wording, God said, leave your country and your father's household and the land I will show you. Now, this is going to seem kind of nitpicky at the start, I will admit, but stay with me. Is this a command or is it a condition? I mean, if it's a command, it would be a straightforward declaration, leave your country. If it's a condition, it would be if then. If you leave your country, then I will bless. So, just given the wording here, which one is it? Is it conditional or is it a command? Yeah, I think it's a command because there's no if there, okay? So let me say it like this. It is unconditional. Or let me use the word in a sentence. The promises of God in Genesis 12 will be fulfilled because he said so. Whether anyone believes them or not, they are unconditional. You probably don't understand why this is so important yet, but trust me, this is a foundational thing that gets reinforced over the next 15 chapters. In fact, the rest of the Old Testament and New Testament as well. Right? But let me illustrate it like this, okay? Tell me your name. Carrie. Okay, Carrie. Let's say Carrie is, use your imagination here. Carrie's out sitting on railroad tracks, all right? Just having a quiet time. Just having a nice quiet time. It's all out in the woods, railroad tracks on there, sitting there. I come up to Carrie and say, hey, Carrie, how you doing? She's fine, right? And I say, Carrie, do you know that there is a train coming down the tracks the opposite direction? And now at this point, she has a choice. Bless you for doing that. All right, she has a choice, whether to believe me or not, right? If she believes me, what will she do? She will get up. If she doesn't believe me, she will sit there. If she believes me or doesn't believe me, does it make any difference whether or not the train is coming down the tracks? No, right? Train's still coming. If she believes me, does it make any difference for her? Yes. So in one sense, it makes a difference for her, but in another sense, it doesn't make any difference whether she believes or not. The train's going to come down the track. Now, the reason I say that is because God says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. Right? Does it matter whether or not Abraham believes or not? Well, it would be better for Abraham if he did believe, because then he could start acting in accordance with what is true, and life is always better when you do that. But in another sense, God is going to fulfill the promises no matter what. Okay? You with me? All right, so stay with me. Let's go on and let's take a look at it. Because I don't know if you believe me or not, but it's true. When we get to the very next story, Genesis 12, verses 10 to 20, Abraham goes down into Egypt to Pharaoh. And that's where he sees Sarah. You know, I trust that you've read the story, you know the details, right? And Sarah is taken into Pharaoh's harem, right? Now, stop right there for a second. Sarah goes to Pharaoh's harem. What does that mean in terms of the promises? Does it have any effect on the promises? The answer is yes, because let's just start with the nation, okay? Can Abraham have a whole nation of people without Sarah? No, it's very hard, very hard. You might say, well, he could get married. Yeah, he could, but when God made the promises, he made them to the two of them. Right? So you have to understand here that if Sarah goes down here, the potential for the promises, the nation is really kind of fading away, and if you don't have a nation, you can't fill up the land, and if you don't have a nation, you're never going to get the leader who comes, right? This is kind of like, did you guys watch the Back to the Future movies when you were little? Right? When you do something bad and your picture starts fading away, you think, oh man, I'm in trouble now, right? So Abraham sees this, puts it all together, and says, wow, that's wrong, right? And at the end of the story, it finishes like this. He wakes up at night, hits himself in the head, and says, what was I thinking? Gets on his horse, rides into Pharaoh, and says, give me my wife back, right? Pharaoh, give me my wife back, right? That's how the story goes. Have you read it carefully enough to know that? Be really kind of nice if it did, right? But it doesn't, does it? No. What happens? God intervenes, inflicts all sorts of diseases on Pharaoh, and Pharaoh wakes up and says, wait, what's going on? Abraham, what's wrong with you? Why did you tell me she was your wife, right? And he kicks him out with all sorts of goods and all this sort of stuff, right? So Sarah then comes back, and as Sarah comes back, watch carefully. This animation will change your life. Are you ready? Are you ready for it? Sarah comes back, and God supernaturally intervenes. Sarah comes back, and oh, wasn't that cool? Right? Let's do it again. It's so much fun. Yes, all the potential for the promises comes back. Right? God supernaturally intervenes. So would you tell me why God supernaturally intervenes here in words that will make my day? Why does God break in to the whole economy of Egypt in order to get this one woman back? In fact, God has to do it. Why? He's faithful to his promises, right? Because God said so. He spoke. Again, notice the way I frame it. He spoke the promises, therefore they have to happen. Therefore, they are unconditional. That's kind of why I emphasize that point, right? Because this story does as well. So let's come up here. I made you Pharaoh first, but I'm going to make you Abraham, okay? Abraham, that was a really stupid thing to do to give your wife to Pharaoh. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Okay. Why did you do that?
I was scared.
You were scared. Okay, that's true. But did you learn your lesson?
I think so.
Okay. You're not going to do it again, right?
Probably not.
You got it. Okay, so you're going to believe?
Yeah.
Okay, good man. I'm glad to hear that. Let's go on. Next story, okay? Next story. I wish we could do the other chapters, but we can't. We're going to go right here to 15. Chapter 15 has been several years. They still don't have a baby boy. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, I'm your shield, and no one will, and the one who will reward you in great abundance. But Abram said, O sovereign Lord, what will you give me, since I continue to be childless, and my heir is Eliezer of Damascus? Now you realize that the child is the key to everything, right? If you don't have a child, you can't have a nation. If you don't have the nation, you can't fill up and possess the land. And of course, the leader is not going to come. So everything is focused about this child. That's why he's asking about it. And so he says, my heir is Eliezer of Damascus. Abraham added, since you have not given me a descendant, then look, one born in my house will be my heir. Do you see what he's doing here? What he's saying is, okay, maybe God didn't mean what he said, and maybe I'm going to actually have to adopt a seed to get the job done. Right? Take a look at God's response to this in light of those promises. Okay? God's response. But look, the word of the Lord came to him. And this is this translation is trying to give you some of the emotion that's in the Hebrew text itself. Look, right? This man will not be your heir, but instead a son who comes from your own body will be your heir. And so it's trying to say what's in the Hebrew text. In the Hebrew text, God is exercised about this, and God says, no, bad idea. Eliezer, not happening. Just trust my word, right? So he takes him outside, gaze in the sky, and count the stars. If you're able to count them, good luck with that one, right? And that's how many you will have. So will your descendants be, right? And he goes out and he looks at it and thinks, oh my goodness. And now I don't know what Sarah thought about that. She looked up at the stars. Oh my goodness, right? But eventually, this is how many descendants you're going to have. Now, the good news is that Abraham believed the Lord and credit to him for righteousness. And I would just like to say, well done, right? Good job. I'm glad that you believed. But then, of course, what you do next is this, right? You come along, you say, okay, God, could you give me a little sign, like a little object lesson, just to reinforce my faith a little bit that I will have this son? And so God says to him, okay, take for me a heifer, a goat, a ram, each 3 years old, along with a dove and a young pigeon, and cut them in two and put them in rows. Now, as you read through here, you think, wow, God came up with a really strange thing to do. But God didn't. This was part of the culture. In fact, when God says to do this strange thing with the animals, he doesn't have to explain it at all to Abraham, because Abraham knows exactly what's going on. This is a very common cultural thing. God is simply using what's in the culture already that he understands to help him get the idea, right? So here's what it looks like. You're going to take these rows of animals, half of the animals right here, a very bloody row, and then the other half of the animals right here, very bloody thing, right? And then two people who are entering into a covenant relationship with each other would get arm in arm and walk through as a way to say, yes, I'm doing this. So let's get two typical Old Testament people, Bernie and Julio, right? Bernie and Julio are getting together in a covenant relationship. Could be anything. Could be like, okay, Bernie owns the apartment house or the apartment tent, and Julio's going to rent it from him. And so they enter into the agreement. Bernie says, I'll provide you a tent that doesn't leak. And Julio says, I'll give you 2 sheep every year to do this, you're right, whatever. And they get together, and they walk through the bloody animals. And by doing that, Bernie is saying, I will keep my conditions, and Julio is saying, I will keep my conditions. Okay? So when they do this kind of thing, it's a very common covenant. And what they're saying is, look, if I don't keep my conditions, I'll pay for it with my life. May I end up like one of these poor pieces of meat here, dead, right? And probably walking through blood too. It's a very serious, sobering thing when you do this. You say, I'm really going to do this. Now, that's the background, right? That's the way it normally would work. What happens this time is this. Get rid of Bernie and Julio. Abram and God come together and walk through the bloody animals together, right? So what it means is Abraham vows to keep his conditions, and God vows to keep his conditions. Am I right about this? You guys read the text carefully enough to know? Right? You were there? No, that's not what happened, right? This is exactly what you would expect to happen, but this did not happen. Can you tell me what actually did happen? Only God went through, right? Exactly. So what happens is God gets ready to go through. Then he takes Abraham, and what does he do with him? He puts him into a deep sleep. He's sitting over there by the tree, and he's so out of it, he doesn't even know what's going on. He's in a deep sleep. God walks through in the form of a smoking fire pot and flame of fire where God often shows up. God vows to keep his conditions. And the whole point of this is that Abraham doesn't go through because there are no human conditions, right? It does not depend upon what Abraham does. It only depends on what God does. All right, let's go back here. Train's coming down the track. Carrie believes, doesn't believe, doesn't matter, train's coming down. Carrie does something stupid and puts her spouse in jeopardy, God will take care of it. Okay? Abraham does something stupid, wants to adopt the seed. God says, no, we're not going that way. I'm going to provide you the seed. Right? So let's take this and plop it down on top of 15, on top of 12. Now, what I'm trying to show you here, I hope this little graphic makes sense, is that I want you to see that all of these things are building. They are not separate promises. They are building. They are clarifying. They're expanding. They are reinforcing the original big idea. Okay? And so Genesis 15 is another good building block for becoming certain that we understand what the promise is all about. Now, you good so far? You with me? Yeah? Okay. Then, let's get on to 16. Now, I don't really have time to talk about 16. Let me just say this, that they fail again in their faith, right? And they think, oh, maybe Sarah shouldn't be the mom, right? Maybe Hagar should be the mom. And they make big mistakes, causes trouble, and then they get back on track, right? Realize that was a dumb idea, won't make that mistake again. We get to chapter 17. Let me talk about this one. Chapter 17 is this place where, I'm going to open up my Bible to 17 so I say it exactly right. This is really a sweet, sweet story. I think I can do this. Yeah. Here we are in 17. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him and said, I am El Shaddai. I am God Almighty. You've heard the name before. I am God Almighty. Walk before me and be blameless. I will confirm my covenant between me and you and will greatly increase your numbers, right? So at this point, Abraham is thinking, okay, yes, this is, I'm going to get the son, right? But God, interestingly enough, starts waxing eloquent, right? It says, no longer will you be called Abram, your name will be Abraham. For I made you father of many nations. I'll make you very fruitful in the nations of you, and kings will come from you, right? He's going on and on and on. And put yourself in Abraham's sandals now at this point. Abraham is thinking, well, those are really cool promises, but really all I want is just what? Just give me one boy, right? Just one baby boy to get this thing started. I love the big promises, right? But just one boy. And God keeps going, kind of like this distracted uncle, that's talking about stuff. And then he gets down here and he says, God also said to Abraham, as for Sarah, your wife, you're no longer to call her Sarai. Her name will be Sarah. I will bless her, and I will surely give you a son by her, and I will bless her so she'll be the mother of nations. Kings of peoples will come from her. And God's going on and on and on. And Abraham's sitting there thinking, yeah, but I could just have one boy. That's all I really, really want, right? And at this point, he can't take it. And notice it says, verse 17, Abraham fell face down, and he laughed and said to himself, will a son be born to me now at this age? Right? So his response to the name change, father of many nations, and Sarah, mother of many nations, is laughter. Now, do you know how you say laughter in Hebrew? You do know how. You just don't know that you know how. You say it in Hebrew like Isaac, right? So literally, the Hebrew says, Abraham fell face down and he Isaaced to himself. Okay? So it's really sweet what God does here. God says, I heard that, right? Then God said, yes, but your wife Sarah will bear you a son, and you will call him Laughter. Now, I don't think God is angry at him. God is simply saying, I heard that you laughed, right? So here's the deal. When he's born, you're going to call him Laughter, and you're going to be reminded every time you call him in for lunch, come on, Laughter, time to wash your hands, right? You're going to remember that I'm the kind of a God who fulfills promises that most people just Isaac at. Dude, you laughed. It's kind of a dumb thing, right? Why'd you laugh? You don't know? Okay. Probably didn't believe, right? Okay, but you're not going to make that mistake again, right? Okay. All right. I'm glad to know. Okay, we're not going to make that mistake again. We've got it. So let's go down and take a look at the next story. The next story is Genesis chapter 18. This is a pretty funny story as well because there are three angels. One of them, I believe, is actually God himself because when he speaks, it says the Lord says. But here is Abraham in the tent. Abraham out front. Sarah is back in the tent. You got these three angels. Two of them go down to Sodom and Gomorrah in chapter 19, but one of them is there, and he's saying to him these words. He's saying to them, then the Lord said, I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah, your wife, will have a son. Right? So imagine the situation here. He's saying, yes, you will have a son. Well, that's great news, but how do you know? And if we're right here, if in fact this is God himself, then you should understand that even in the Old Testament, John chapter 1 says, no one has seen God at any time, but the only begotten, that is Jesus, he has revealed him. So you might not realize this, but there are a lot of times when God shows up, like in Genesis 1 and 2, and he walks with Adam in the cool of the day. Right? He appears before Joshua going to Jericho. He appears to Abraham when they're up on top of the mountain of Exodus, on the mountain Sinai. So God shows up, and it's Jesus, right? He's the one who does this. He is the one who reveals him. I don't know what his body looks like, but it's the person of Jesus there speaking to them, okay? So if this is Jesus, think of the irony here, right? This is the seed. This is the seed. Yes, you will have a son. Well, that's great news, but how do you know? Well, if Isaac isn't born, I can't be born, right? I don't know how the conversation went. Well, wait a minute. Who are you and how can you be born? Sorry, it gets complicated, but just stay away from kings who think your wife is hot, okay? Trust me on this one. Probably not exactly the way the conversation went, but easily could have, because those things are all relevant in this story. And I just think it's really, really funny, because the best part of it is then this, right? The text says, Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent, which was behind him. Abraham and Sarah were already old and well advanced in years. Sarah was past the age of childbearing, so Sarah Isaaced to herself, after I'm worn out and my master's old, well, now I have this pleasure of having a son, right? So she's there, and she's saying, oh, that's so silly to think a woman of my age could have a mother. Isaac, right? So we come up to Abraham again and say, man, look what you did. Now your wife is laughing, right? Because you did too. This is really a stupid thing to do, right? You're not going to do this again, are you? No. Okay, good. Glad to hear it. Let's take a look at the next story. Whoa, wait a minute. I'm sorry, the PowerPoints are wrong. I messed up. We can't. We already saw this, didn't we? This was Genesis chapter 12, right? Oh, wait a minute. This is Genesis chapter 20. As Sarah goes to Abimelech, and the same thing happens all over again, and God goes to Abimelech and says, you're a dead man, give her back. And he does. Oh, no, wait. Did you go in and write in and save the day on that one? No, you did. God had to do it all over again, didn't he? Yeah, so God supernaturally intervenes, brings Sarah back. The promises are unconditional still. And that's probably a pretty good thing, because if I were God, and it's a really good thing I'm not, but if I were God or you were God, what would you do with Abraham at this point? Right? And this is the spot where I would say, dude, it's really been a good ride so far, but obviously you just can't get with the program, so we're going to have to make some changes, right? And find somebody who can. But God doesn't do that. God won't do that. In fact, I would be so bold as to say God can't do that. Because why? Because he's faithful to his promises, and he said he was going to bring it through Abraham and Sarah, right? So even though Abraham keeps making stupid mistakes and keeps stumbling, God is faithful. And indeed, that's where we are in chapter 21. Chapter 21 says this really sweet little thing about the birth. Sarah became pregnant, bore a son. Abraham gave him the name Isaac. The very thing that God had promised him. And where does she say? I'm missing it. Yeah, here it is, verse 6. Sarah said, God has brought me laughter, and everyone who hears about this will laugh with me. Now, that's a really, really sweet story. It's a perfect way to finish the whole thing up. We should just close our Bibles, leave class, and go away happy. But, no, it's not going to happen. Don't get your hopes up. Because God says, no. You totally miss it. This is not the end of the story. There's another part of the story which is absolutely necessary to be told. And I haven't gotten to it yet. And so let me show you what it is, and it is right here. The sacrificing of Isaac. Now, this is one of those things that we really need to talk about because it's so badly misinterpreted. People come to this story, and they don't read it in the context of the flow of the promises, and they think, wow, isn't God mean? Right? And so traditionally, now, just a little help here when you're taking notes. When I say traditionally, that probably means wrong answer, okay? So if you write this down and you study it and you see here are some answers, remember these are wrong answers, right? Traditionally, people say what this is about is, do you love your boy more than God? And maybe you've heard this preached that way, right? If there's anything in your life you love more than God, God's going to take it away. And so God's really, really jealous here. Or just how obedient will you be, right? Like God is up there and he has this dog and you're the dog and he's holding the treat up to see how high you can go, right? And you just test them just to tease them and see how far they will go. And I would argue that both of those things are really terribly wrong because it makes God out to be something that he's not. It's people who haven't read the story carefully, because this is not about either one of those things. What this is really about is this. Well, can you tell me? What is this story about as you've watched the story progress? Remember how we took Sarah and we brought her over here to Pharaoh or to Abimelech? What happened to the promises? Right. They wouldn't be fulfilled. Could we do that right now where we are in Genesis 22? If we take Sarah away and give her to another king, what's going to happen to the promises? Promises are fine. Why? Because it doesn't depend upon her anymore, because now Isaac is here. Do you understand that in a lot of ways, not in a lot of ways, every way, he has taken her place because he is now the key to the promises. If he dies, what happens to the promises? Right, they go away. So you'll understand here. In reality, what this is a test of, do you believe that I will keep my promises? So what God is doing is coming back here one more time and interviewing this guy in this act and saying, you really going to trust me? Are you?
Yes.
Well, let's take a look at the deal here, right? What happens is this. It says, by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. But what was going on in his head? Because if you take a look at the text here in Genesis 22, it says this. God says to him, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on the mountain I will tell you about. Early the next morning, Abraham got up, saddled his donkey. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. Now, that's the phrase right there. We are going to go worship, and then we will come back to you. What was going on in Abraham's head? Servants are right here. They go over here, they build an altar, they put the wood on it, and that's where the boy's going to be. And then he says, I and the boy will come back. What's going through his head? I'll give you two options. Right? You can pick the right one. What Abraham is thinking is this: I will go over here, build this altar, put the wood on it, put my boy up there, and then I will bring the knife up and I'll bring it right down about here. And at that point, I'm pretty sure God's going to show up and say, time out, just wanted to see, right, what was going on. Whew. I'll breathe a big sigh of relief, take my boy off, and we will walk back. Or is he thinking this: I will take my boy over, put him on the altar, bind him up, and bring the knife up, and I will bring the knife down and plunge it into his heart, and he will die. And I will watch my son die right in front of my eyes, and then I will take the fire and burn him up into ashes. But then, because these promises have to come true, I believe that God will take those ashes and form them back together into my son. He will get off the altar, and we will walk back. You know which one he was thinking? He was thinking the second one. I know that because Scripture actually says that. And he not only was thinking that we will walk back, but then he will go home and he will find the woman whom God has for him, and he will have a son, who will have a son, who will have a son, who will have a seed, who will rescue the entire world. I know that's exactly what he was thinking, because that's what Hebrews 11 says. He who had received the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, right? That's the only begotten son. That's the son through whom the promises come. Even though God had said, it is through Isaac your offspring will be reckoned. It's through Isaac that all the promises are going to come. And so he says this. This is what he's reasoning in his head, right? He's reasoning in his head. Look, if Isaac dies, then the promises are going to have to die. But I have learned one thing over all these dumb mistakes that I've made, right? When I made the mistake with Pharaoh in chapter 12, when I made the mistake with Eliezer in chapter 15, when I made the mistake with Hagar in chapter 16, when I laughed in chapter 17, and when my wife laughed in chapter 18, and even 20, where I gave her away to Abimelech. I have learned through these stupid mistakes that God is not going to let the promises go. And so the text says, if the promises have to stay, the text says, Abraham reasoned that God could raise the dead, and figuratively speaking, he did receive Isaac back from the death. So when he said, I and the boy will come back to you, he had already figured it out. If I go through with this, God will raise him back up. Now, is that faith? Oh my goodness. You and I have had like 2,000 years to get used to the idea of resurrection. He'd never even heard the word. He just had to figure it out, knowing over 30 years of watching God, how God performs, that God would do whatever was necessary to make the promises come true, because when he speaks his word, it happens. It's an amazing, amazing statement of faith. So, Isaac indeed does come back. And what this tells me is that if God hadn't stopped him, Abraham would have gone through with it, and God would have raised him from the dead in order to make sure the promises happen. So you look at this and you realize, wow, this is an amazing story of faith in the promises. And I just want to show you one more little detail about it that maybe you would have missed. This is one of the reasons why we're going to study the atlases. This is a picture right out of the atlas. And one of the things you have to know is that when you look at the land of Israel, you see the Sea of Galilee up there, you see the Dead Sea here and the Jordan in between, that if you go to the top of the Dead Sea and you go 1/3 of the way to the Mediterranean coast, which is right there, that's where Jerusalem is. Right? Now watch this. We're down in Beersheba, and God says, go to the mountain of Moriah. And so for 3 days, he thinks and thinks and thinks about this and gets to the place of Moriah, which of course is also Jerusalem. And so he takes his beloved son, through whom the promises will come, he puts the wood on his back and walks him up a hill. Sounding familiar to you? And this son doesn't have to be sacrificed, because there's another father who loves his son, who's going to watch his son, through whom the promises are going to come, walk up a hill with wood on his back. Right? And so when you take a look at what goes on here, it's an amazing story. Because Hebrews 11 says, by faith, when he was tested, offered up Isaac, he would receive the promises, was offering up his only begotten son. Right? The only 2 boys called only begotten, very special sons, Isaac and, of course, the other one in John 3:16. So we've seen the way Noah was kind of a picture. Also, I want to see that Isaac is kind of a picture as well. And all this does for you is you realize after the whole story is told, wow, we even saw predictions and little previews ahead of time, so that the one who started the whole thing knew how it was going to end before it even began. Now, one little story about Sarah dying, which you've probably never even thought about before, or probably never heard a sermon on, because it seems like such a weird, useless story. A whole chapter dedicated to her dying. Why do that? Well, it's Genesis 23. In the text, let me put it back up here. The text says this. Sarah lived to be 127 years old, which makes me wonder, was she still hot at the end of that time? I don't know. You know, when she's 90, people are thinking, whoa, maybe wrinkles were in her. I don't know. Maybe they didn't have wrinkles. I don't know. But she finally dies at 127, right? And then Abraham rose from beside his dead wife and spoke to the Hittites. He said, I am an alien and a stranger among you. Only place where you see that in the Old Testament. Sell me some property for a burial site here so I can bury my dead. And the Hittite speaks to him, Sir, listen to us. Now, I'm not going to do the whole story here, but I trust you've read it carefully enough to know what happens. Let me show you where we are. We are right here at a place called Hebron, right? Hebron is the spot, and it's a really important spot because she is buried here, but also because it's the highest spot in southern Israel, which is a really nice thing to be up high in a hot climate. It's really close to Jerusalem, and that's why this becomes important. In Hebron, he buries his wife, and he says, give me a place, let me buy some land. And it looks like Ephron the Hittite has been a really nice guy. If you read that through your 21st century Western lenses, you think, what a nice guy this is. But if you've been around the world very much, you'll understand that most of the world has this thing called bartering, where they play games. And especially if you go to the Middle East, you'll understand it, and you realize Ephron the Hittite is not being a nice guy. He's playing a very shrewd game. Because first he says, oh, just go take the land, it's fine, have it, right? Abraham says, no, I can't do that, I got to buy it. He says, well, okay, if you have to buy it, just take it for 400 shekels. What is that between you and me, right? Now, if you have a good study Bible, it'll tell you what that is. You know what it is? It's absolute stinking highway robbery, right? It's 10 or 20 times what it should be. And what's happening is exactly what Abraham says. I'm an alien and a stranger among you, right? How he's being treated like an outsider. You're going home for Thanksgiving, your tire goes flat right outside of Podunk, Indiana, and you're desperate. You've got to get home. And a guy says, hey, I can fix that tire. I can give you a patched-up tire for a mere $600, right? You say, wow, thanks for the deal, right? It's called highway robbery. That's what this is. So you put this whole story together. He finally pays that money, and he buries his wife, and you got to ask yourself, what does it say about fulfillment of the promises? Why is this story even here? Well, here's why it is here. Because when we get to the end of his life, what it tells us is this. God had told him he was going to inherit the entire land. But how is he treated at the end of his life? Like an alien and a stranger, like he doesn't own any of it. The only thing he owns is a little burial plot that he had to pay through the nose to get. Has God fulfilled the promises of the land? Now think very carefully with me here, because the knee-jerk reaction, once you want to give the Sunday school answer and say, oh yes, God fulfills all his promises. God does eventually fulfill all his promises, but here's the question. Has God fulfilled the promise of the land yet? No, right? You don't need to be ashamed or embarrassed about it. What this story is meant to tell is we do not have the land. In fact, we don't have the nation yet. We only got one boy, and we haven't got the leader either. Right? We are just getting started, but that's okay because, watch this. In Hebrews chapter 11 it says, all these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted they were aliens and strangers on the earth. Now stop right there. The only place in the Old Testament where Abraham says that is Genesis 23. When the writer of Hebrews chapter 11 is speaking, he is actually giving us a commentary on Genesis 23. He's saying the big idea of what's going on here is they didn't have the promises yet. Is that bad? And the answer is no, because that's exactly the way it is with you and me too. Jesus has come, but the fullness of our redemption is not here at all yet. In the very same way, we're living like aliens and strangers in a place that is not our home, looking for Jesus to come back and make it our home. So Abraham's situation is not all that different from ours because we are still looking for that stuff. And that's why the writer says, they were all commended for their faith, yet none of them received what had been promised. God had planned something better for us so that only together with us would they receive the promises. So if you find yourself saying, wow, I don't feel the fullness, I'm not there with the tree of life yet, that's absolutely normal. That's why God requires faith. That's why God is trying to bring us in to a relationship where when he speaks a word, we will look and say, I don't know, is Eliezer a better option? Till we eventually would get to the point where God says, take your son and sacrifice, and we say, look, if God says it, I'm going to do it. Right? That's the journey. Abraham is not the hero of the story. You see who the hero of the story is? The hero of the story is the one who puts up with Abraham over a span of his entire life in order to bring him to a point where he says, whatever you say, I will do, because I know you're too good to hurt me and too faithful not to keep your word. If God can bring us to that point, then Satan has no chance to say, are you sure that word is true?